So, can you give us a little snapshot of the AgriStability program? I mean, obviously, the people watching on the agriculture side will know of it, but from reading through it, I think there's actually confusion even within the ag sector about it. So, can you give us that sort of high level of what it is, and then we'll dive into some of the topics about it?
Yeah, AgriStability is a margin-based insurance product that has been available for a number of years. In various forms. It's been called AgriStability for quite some time now. Prior to that, it was called CASE, CFIP, ADA, and then there were some provincial versions as well. So it all started back in 1995 in Alberta and 1997 in the rest of the country. And the concept of this margin-based insurance has been similar. It's evolved over those years. And, currently we have a program where we're comparing the current year with a 5-year history where the high and the low are dropped. The margins that comprise the program are all come out of tax information. So, if this is the tax information, the margins are a subset of the tax information because there's certain things that are allowable for AgriStability and there's certain things that are non-allowable and don't make it into those margins. So if you compare the current margin with the history, with the high and low drops averaged, and you drop by more than 30% of, relative to that average, then you get benefits at 70 cents on the dollar.
I see. So this is a program, I mean, around since 95, that's a while. There's been a lot of changes. Why has the program, has it evolved to market demand, or have they just continued to, find new ways to do it? What has sort of been the drivers for change within the program itself?
Well, the main driver is the fact that these programs are offered in 5-year terms, 5-year frameworks. And we're currently in the middle of a framework. It ends after 2022. A new one starts in 2023. So every 5 years, the programs get reconsidered. And AgriStability is one of the programs as far as ag policy goes. So at a minimum, every 5 years, there are going to be some considerations. But they also have a regular review that they do 2 years in to those 5-year cycles. And that's what you're kind of seeing right now is some things have come out of that 2-year review. Just a little over a year ago, something came out on private insurance. And more recently, something has come out removing a program feature called reference margin limiting. So that's those are the two main things that I'm going to be focusing on here today.
So are those the two are those the two main changes, or are there other changes to the program coming out?
Those are the two main changes, and they are effective for the 2020, 2021, and 2022 years, because of course, as I said, the new framework is starting for 2023.
So you'd mentioned, let's focus on the private. So did you say that private insurance they've come out and forgive the very layman questions, but I'm sure I'm not the only one that will have some of these types of questions. So what are the changes that the private insurance has made, and how is that affecting, or have they adapted because of the private insurance? Can you sort of unpack that?
Well, I think over the last number of years, in the prairie provinces in particular, we've seen the rollout of a couple of private insurance products. One is called Global Ag Risk Solutions. The other is called Just Solutions. Those are both to be used on crop farms. And I'm not going to say as a result of that, but, I think at the same time in these 5-year frameworks, the government has had one aspect of the framework. It's called agri-risk initiatives, where they encourage not-for-profit entities to experiment and design new private products. So I think the move to include private insurance in a risk management strategy is something that the government is actually encouraging by incentivizing that. GARS and Just Solutions are both profit-oriented businesses, so they weren't covered by that government initiative. But I think the government saw an opportunity that there's some good private options out there, and was there a way to incentivize people to take those private options? So when we look at the change in treatment of private insurance proceeds for AgriStability, you're going to see the incentivization that kind of results out of this change.
So could you sort of walk me through the change again, just so I have a better understanding? And again, I'm probably about 50 steps behind where you're at with it. So could you just kind of walk me through? I think you have a slide, and I kind of want to use that as a reference point.
Yeah, so the treatment of private insurance proceeds is changing for the 2020, 2021, and 2022 years. And the way these private insurance proceeds were treated before is that when you calculated the AgriStability margin and benefits, you had to include the private insurance proceeds in there. And so by doing that, that would effectively reduce the amount of AgriStability benefits that you'd otherwise receive. So now the treatment of that is changing, whereby you no longer have to include those private insurance proceeds in the calculation of your AgriStability. So effectively, you can benefit from taking private insurance and AgriStability and have the coverages stack on one another. And that's the nature of the visual, is it shows you in 2019, represented by some boxes, an amount of private insurance proceeds. It shows the same amount for 2020, and then it shows AgriStability benefits that might otherwise be received for 2019 and 2020. And then when we click on that slide, the private insurance comes down, and in 2019, it squashes the AgriStability, whereas in 2020, it sits on top. So, that's representative of the fact that, the treatment is changing so that now you can stack or double up on the coverage. It no longer claws away at your AgriStability benefit. It could have reduced or eliminated that benefit before.
Will that, now, just from the other side, as a private insurer, is there a scenario where that incentivizes them to get into the market more for more private insurance options, of course, then making it more competitive, or would that not really be applicable?
No, I think the incentivization works a couple of different ways. With this new treatment for AgriStability, it should incentivize farmers to look a little more seriously at the private options, right? Because you can double up on coverage. Whereas if you're taking something like crop insurance, the effect of receiving crop insurance, is the same as the way private insurance was treated before, that the crop insurance comes into the AgriStability calculation and effectively reduces the AgriStability payment. Whereas now the private insurance is not going to do that. So it's an incentive for producers to look at those private options and to, compare those with crop insurance and see how these various products work together, and, what is going to make the best combination for their farm for any given year. As far as the insurance companies go, the private insurers, I think it also does incentivize them to get into the market, because if the government is going to, support this treatment of private insurance. As I said, they had the incentive for people to create private insurance programs. It is beneficial to get into the market.
On the second point, and I'm just going to read it to make sure I get the term right, the removal of reference margin limiting. I won't even pretend to be an expert on this. Can you walk us through that and what that means?
Yeah, the reference margin limiting was a pretty controversial and poorly understood program feature. It was brought in 2013, and it changed again in 2018. But the problem was that in order to understand the way it had changed in 2018, you had to understand the way it worked in 2013. And, not too many people were able to connect those two things together or follow how that worked. So what reference margin limiting did was, as I spoke of previously, I spoke about the 5-year average where the high and low are dropped and the remaining 3 margins are averaged. Those margins consisted of allowable income minus allowable expense. And what the reference margin limiting did was it would limit the reference margin. So it would give some producers a lower number than that number that was otherwise calculated. The lower number was tied in some way to the expenses that was in that original margin, but it was pretty hard to follow how that worked. Or even whether it applied to any given farmer, depending on how keen they were on reading their assessment or understanding that. So it was a poorly understood feature. It only affected certain types of farms. It didn't affect everybody. But I think it resulted in some confusion because it did significantly limit benefits for certain farms because, of course, if your coverage level is going down, then you have to drop even more to get benefits from that. So I think that even people that weren't necessarily affected by it realized that the program had changed adversely and may have had less confidence in the program as a result or dropped out of the program.
So if they're removing that, is that going to be, I guess maybe the word would be responsive for farmers, or just easier to navigate, or are there specific things that they now can access because of it?
Yeah, I think you hit on the 2 main points there, Jared. Removing of the reference margin limiting makes the program a lot simpler because you no longer have this additional calculation that has to be done that a lot of producers didn't understand or understand fully to begin with. So that's one aspect of it. But the main thing is for some of them, the ones that were affected by it in the past, the program is going to become more responsive. It's going to become quite a bit more responsive. So the challenge is figuring out, are you one of those farmers that was impacted by it? And what is the impact? How beneficial is that going to be for you? And I think when people see some of the visuals that we have or really understand that change, that they recognize that it is going to be quite beneficial.
Can we actually walk through this? You have an interesting slide here about the removal of reference margin limiting. Can you walk us through that slide a bit? Because I'll be honest, I was looking at this earlier today. This was a little bit of a last minute show, so I didn't get to quite absorb as much information as I would have liked. So if you could walk us through, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so on this particular slide, we've got what I call the margin drop trigger point, no reference margin limit versus reference margin limit. And, the long and the short of it is that with this change, that margin drop trigger point is now 30% for everybody, all farms. Right. All farms for 2020 and future years are going to require only a 30% drop in their margin to trigger AgriStability benefits.
Right.
When they had that reference margin limiting feature in there, which is represented by the red on this particular slide here, there was an area, and you'll see 2 rectangles there. Think of the rectangles as a reference margin, and if you look under the red, that reference margin is split up into 3 sections. The top section was the area where reference margin limiting might apply to some farms. And so the government would draw a line in there somewhere. And the line could be anywhere in that box or right down to the bottom of that box. So that became the reference margin instead of the whole box.
Right.
And what it meant was that the producer then had to have even a greater drop in their current year relative to that reference margin to trigger benefits. And effectively, what it amounted to for certain farms was they had to have a drop of somewhere between 30 and 51% in their margin to trigger benefits. So, without knowing the math of how that works, it already, I think, sounds pretty good that if you had to have a drop of 30 to 51% before, and now you only have to have a drop of 30, well, that could be quite advantageous for you.
Right. And it's eliminating all the confusion, right? I mean, now as a farmer, you could just essentially, as soon as you hit that point that it's triggered.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Steve, I just want to get a clarification on something, and I hope you haven't already explained it and I just misunderstood it. If a farmer qualifies today, let's say this year, now can they backdate it? Can they apply for 2016 if they also applied then, or is it in that 5-year window? How does that sort of work for backdating what they would qualify for?
So this removal of reference margin limiting is effective for the 2020, 2021, and 2022 years. It wasn't announced until early this year, so in 2021, but there's always a 1-year lag with respect to meeting some of the requirements of these programs. So in 2020, producers had to make a decision that they wanted to participate in this kind of insurance in AgriStability. So that decision is already made. They're locked into that. But for those that are locked in, this change is retroactive to 2020. For 2021, they still have an opportunity to make that decision to lock themselves into AgriStability. Normally, this decision is made, it has to be made by April 30th of the year, but the government has extended it, and that's part of the program change is the extension of the deadline to June 30th to participate.
Yeah, on the MNP side, I know you're here trying to educate and so I know you're not trying to make a big MNP plug, but I kind of want you to at this point, because where's MNP coming into this whole conversation? You're obviously coming on the show to let people know, but what is the avenue that people are staying up to date and knowing when these deadlines are? Is that in an annual accounting meeting? Is that their insurer updating? Is the government sending notifications? How are farmers actually staying informed?
Well, I think that would be multi-pronged, and I think you've mentioned the main things there. The government does inform people that these programs are out there. They're busy informing people right now of the changes and the potential impact, and so are we as an accounting firm. So we have a way of preparing AgriStability applications as a firm that we refer to as our full service approach, because back in the early 2000s, the government kind of abandoned the model where you had to fill out pages and pages of application that actually came to a payment at the end.
Okay.
They felt that was too complicated for producers. So they felt that by simplifying the form and just requiring little bits of information, that would simplify it for the producer. We made the decision at the time to continue calculating those benefits. And so we've become quite proficient over the years at doing that, because every time we file an application, we're estimating the benefit. And we have a means of comparison then when the government comes back with an assessment, we compare that, and you learn from it every time, right? Because it's, if there's a difference, is it our mistake? Is it the government's mistake? Or did the client provide some information that wasn't quite right? So you learn from those things, and, you learn how to prepare strong submissions that are going to support your payment estimate.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure. It's honestly not my favorite thing to do, so I'm glad you're doing it to fill out some of these forms and put this stuff together. It's I've helped other people, and then I've been helped as soon as it gets too complicated. So I was just curious sort of how they're actually walking through that process. But MNP is actually doing some of that heavy lifting and filling out the more detailed version of this.
That's right. And, we also have an initiative on the go right now where we've identified our clients that aren't in AgriStability, And we're explaining these changes to them because we feel that these changes could be beneficial for a number of them. So if it's something that could potentially help them with their risk management strategy, that's something that we're going to recommend.